Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to give a kind of an overview of the motivations of different leaders, world leaders, in the processes of the Korean War, looking at the leaders of North and South Korea, and of course Stalin, Mao, and Truman, but also the viewpoint of the British at this time, who sent significant numbers of troops with the UN task force, and their view of their declining position in Asia. When we're talking about the context of the Korean War, it's beginning in 1950. The 5 years between the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Korean War see a phase of Cold War tensions where it could still reasonably be argued that a state of flux existed. In 1948, there had been Stalin's challenge to the West over Berlin, and the following year the communist bomb had been detonated. The first atomic bomb in Russia had been detonated, and also the fall of China to communism had occurred. Not only did this lead to acute anti-communist anxieties in America, the detonation of the first Soviet bomb and the fall of China to communism led to a great deal of the energies in America that lead to the McCarthyite anti-communist era. But also there was a sense within the communist world that communism was in the ascendancy, that the crises of the Second World War had torn open societies in Europe and Asia, and that really the final confrontation with capitalism was just around the corner. These are concepts that really don't exist 20 years later, and there is a confidence in the final triumph of communism in 1950 that certainly by the time you get to characters like Brezhnev in the Soviet Union has long since gone. It was assumed as well, particularly by Mao, that America did not have the resolve to resist China in Korea, and did not have the desire to become engaged in a full-scale war. And before Vietnam, this was the first experience by the USA and also by its Western allies in the UN task force of an inconclusive military stalemate. There's an old adage, obviously, that every country tends to fight the last war. And this was kind of the case in the assumptions of the US and the American allies in the Korean War. The idea that the war might be inconclusive doesn't really occur to American military planners in 1950, and it's assumed that the military successes that were enjoyed in the Second World War are possible and likely, particularly when you have the war being prosecuted from Incheon onwards by General Douglas MacArthur. By the time the Korean War ends and a stalemate does emerge, the only one leader that doesn't believe a stalemate has occurred at all is Mao Zedong, who is convinced that China has inflicted a conclusive defeat over the USA, and this was a key part of Maoist propaganda from 1953 onwards. The idea that that Mao had eclipsed the Soviet Union and had eclipsed the successor to Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, and had shown that the Chinese route to communism could prevail not only over the United States of America, but also on over the Soviet Union, who had, in Mao's estimation, never been able to achieve such a feat as defeating the USA. Now, these views by Mao are obviously highly questionable. It's arguable that the Chinese presented an enormous challenge to the USA. However, whether you can realistically argue that the USA was defeated in Korea it was a contentious debate that perhaps we haven't got time for just now. But it's important to bear in mind that this view was held in China, and the fact that it was held by Mao shapes a great deal of what happens next in China, at any rate. And the view that Mao had defeated America was a key part of his personal appeal, particularly during the period of the Great Leap Forward and later during the Cultural Revolution. Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. It was agreed in 1945 at the Potsdam Conference. By this point, both the South and the North were occupied by US and Soviet forces, respectively. But it would take another 5 years for the fate of the peninsula to be fully decided. The Korean situation was kind of an afterthought for both sides, where the issue of Berlin and Poland were the most contentious and most significant matters discussed at Potsdam and at Yalta beforehand. And the question as to the fate of Europe was really the kind of the key point around which the entire conference revolves. So the question of Korea is, as I said, something of an afterthought at the Potsdam Conference. Stalin at this point is aiding and gradually stepping up his aid to the communists in China, who seized power in 1949. And the seizure of power of Mao in 1949, in addition to the decision in January 1950 by the USA to start to scale down support for the South Korean regime in January that year, the regime of Syngman Rhee, who was the rather kind of illiberal right-wing puppet of the United States. The US just makes this decision in 1950 because it assumes that Korea is really no longer part of the defense perimeter that it has established in Asia to contain communism. These events, the arrival of a regime in China, a communist regime in China, and the gradual withdrawal of support for the regime in the South, made it much more likely that a war was going to occur in Korea. Kim Il-sung, who was the Soviet-backed dictator of North Korea, who'd been installed by Stalin in 1945, was desperate for Stalin, his patron, to grant him permission to invade the US-backed regime in the South. And he knew that as the Americans became less enthusiastic about the South, there was going to be more of an opportunity to do so. So he needs large amounts of equipment, he needs tanks, aircraft, he needs artillery, he needs trucks to move troops around, all this kind of stuff. And Stalin is largely hesitant about this. He can't see what immediately the Soviet Union can gain from getting involved in Korea. And he knows that there is immense risk to the Soviet Union, particularly as the tensions and rules of the Cold War are gradually being established, and that having suffered something of a humiliation over Berlin, he either has the opportunity of winding up with a full-scale war on his hands that he doesn't want, or being humiliated again over Korea. So there's a high-risk stuff. Khrushchev, later on, perhaps as part of his wider criticism of Stalin, said that Stalin was actually petrified of the USA and desperate not to engage the USA in warfare, and for all his kind of rather arrogant and bragging sort of talk, he was very concerned that the USA not be angered by the Soviet Union. Stalin so looks at Korea and says that, I did help Mao into power and helped him operate from Manchuria, which was Soviet occupied, and gave him weapons seized from the Japanese. But I knew that when I was doing that, he wasn't going to be attacking Westerners directly. This was a Chinese civil war. The possibility of a war against South Korea being waged also against the US Army in South Korea, and what small contingents of Western forces there are already, isn't particularly palatable. And also there is some possibility of anti-communist Western alliance getting involved, and would ideally need to be very careful when dealing with them. So Stalin is hugely circumspect initially about the Korean War, and he's also rather circumspect about Mao. Mao had visited Stalin for the first time in late 1949 and stayed till early 1950, and managed to come away with a trade treaty, the Chinese Friendship Treaty of 1950, which turned out on closer inspection to be an extremely bad deal for China, and saw really a net flow of wealth travel westwards along the Trans-Siberian back into Russia. Mao had been snubbed to some extent by Stalin. He had been invited to Stalin's birthday celebrations, and then kept waiting for several weeks before he had an audience with Stalin, whom he venerated and saw as his mentor and his kind of guiding light. And so the dent to Mao's pride and his ego were considerable, and he hoped to demonstrate to Stalin the worth of communist China and the value that China would have in the communist world. And also he looked with an eye to the future, post-Stalin, about replacing the Soviet leadership as the leadership of the communist world with Chinese leadership. And so the decision to wage war in Korea is partly motivated by a wariness by the Soviets to become fully involved, and also by a heightened enthusiasm by Mao to show precisely the revolutionary ardour of the People's Liberation Army and what it's capable of in the battlefield. The Soviets, as I'd mentioned before, detonated their first bomb in 1949, and Stalin, up until that point, knew that he couldn't really afford to tangle with the USA. Even after the detonation of the first bomb, Stalin was still aware that the Soviets were far behind in nuclear technology. The southern regime of Syngman Rhee had become more vulnerable by 1950, obviously because America was kind of cooling off its interest in Korea. And it's this that makes Stalin decide, or becomes a significant factor in Stalin deciding to give Kim Il Sung the nod. But he said to Kim Il Sung that he would not lift a finger to help if the Americans got involved, and that meant that the job would be outsourced to Mao, and the responsibility of fighting America would fall to China. And it's the view of a number of historians, particularly Frank Dakota in his trilogy on China 1945 to 76, and also Robert Gallatin in Stalin's Curse, that Stalin's calculations about Western resolve were obviously wrong, and the responsibility for the war is in no small part down to Stalin. But also, you have to look at the assumptions that Mao made. Mao thought that if China became involved, that America would just back down. He thought that the American population was kind of well fed and well provided for, and that living standards were going up in America, and this by and large meant that they wouldn't risk a long drawn out bloody war in Asia, which had little bearing on the lives of most American people. And in that regard, he was both right and wrong. Certainly, wars in Asia prove increasingly unpopular, but America seems to have the capacity to continue with these conflicts for far longer periods of time than anyone's really bargained for. Mao also assumed that America would have no interest in invading China itself, and that a war would be fought exclusively in the Korean Peninsula, and it would be a war that could be conclusively won by China. And this was obviously not what occurs. What finally occurs is a stalemate. And both Stalin and Mao's Cold War calculations are partly to blame here. But also, the outcome of the war is greatly decided by not only Harry Truman, but also his general Douglas MacArthur. In 1947, when Britain faced bankruptcy, the British had withdrawn from significant parts of their Cold War role. They had withdrawn from Greece and Turkey, while in Greece they'd been fighting an anti-communist civil war on the side of the Greek royalists. And the reason why Britain was facing bankruptcy is because, in return for an loan agreed in August 1945, the British had promised to end restrictions on currency convertibility. So that meant that the pound could be sold for dollars, and the owning of dollars was a far more attractive proposition in 1947 than the owning of pounds. So the pound crashes and the British economy with it. And the irony for the Americans is that they eventually have to pick up the tab of fighting communist forces in places like Greece. And the Truman Doctrine was Harry Truman's way of trying to impress upon the domestic American population that this is was really important in containing communism and preventing its advance. Truman in 1950 looked at the already American client state of South Korea and referred to it as the Greece of the Far East. Within hours of the invasion, the United Nations Security Council had responded, and Truman had hoped that the crisis would be resolved without large numbers of American troops on the ground. But when the North Koreans refused to withdraw, that hope was quickly extinguished. The Americans, in comparison to the Chinese and the Russians, had created a far smaller peacetime army. There'd been mass demobilization, and it was only figures like MacArthur who were advocating within Asia, at least, that American forces were not drawn down in this manner. He said that there should also be American intervention and the guarantee of protection to Indochina, Taiwan, and the Philippines, and across Asia, from the borders of India all the way through to the Pacific. America offers a series of guarantees of protection against communist subversion. And it is this that, in a number of ways, sets up the later American intervention in Vietnam. During the Korean War, Truman was chiefly concerned in preventing a third world war with China and the Soviet Union. And this leads obviously to tensions with MacArthur, who thought that the invasion of China using nuclear weapons was going to be the only way to win. MacArthur had an obsessional fear and hatred of communism, so much so that he assumed that it was what was happening in America during the New Deal, and had a hugely chaotic and neurotic relationship with Franklin Roosevelt. The worldview of MacArthur and MacArthur's general egotism led him to see himself not as a general who was there to carry out the orders of an American commander-in-chief, but as an independent crusader against communism himself. He thought that a world struggle against communism was underway, and that he was in charge of policy in Korea. Truman had a rock-bottom popularity at this point in 1951, and was determined to show that he could take a hard line against communism. And Korea would be a test case showing that it was possible to hold the line in Korea. And this is part of how the British thought as well. The British were obviously thinking in terms of their much diminished colonial position in Asia. The conservative politician, later Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, said in December 1950 that the fate of Britain and Europe combined rested on the outcome of events in Korea. And he said, "I'm sure that a moral defeat in Korea would mean the end of the white man's position in the East, and the moral collapse might spread to the West." And in here he was talking of a kind of a very crude and obviously quite racist version of the domino theory. And that he said that if Indochina goes, Siam follows, then Malay falls. Hong Kong is of course indefensible in such circumstances. Burma goes next, and communism may easily seize India. Europe's supremacy in the world largely depends on her position in Africa and Asia. Now, of course, I'll do far more on the Korean War at another time, and go much further into the actual waging of the war and kind of military history and that sort of thing. But it's one of the kind of the ironic and tragic postscripts to the Korean War was that finally, when MacArthur is dismissed, he demanded that the Chinese come and make peace with him directly, trying to sort of eclipse Truman, and that he threatened to personally invade China, something that no general, American or otherwise, really has the authority to do without the say-so of a government. Truman has no choice but to get rid of him. However, the dismissal of MacArthur and the subsequent stalemate 2 years later led many in American political life, diplomatic life, military life, and across a broad spectrum of American public opinion to conclude that had MacArthur been allowed to stay on and to prosecute an all-out war of annihilation against the communists, then there would have been no stalemate in Korea. And in Vietnam later on, the paralysis that the various American administrations get into over whether to fight the war all out or not, whether to draw down, is perpetuated by this myth, and it is a key part of the schism between America's hawks and doves that keeps the Vietnam War going on year after year after year. Anyway, more on Vietnam another time. Thanks very much, everybody, for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this. And there's been some really great conversations and tons of support for the podcast happening on the Explaining History Facebook page, so check it out. It'd be great to say hi, and I shall speak to you all soon. All the best, bye-bye.